God created the worlds. And if he created the worlds, and since he did, then he created it with a purpose. And what was that purpose? To provide a habitable place called planet Earth, to raise up living creatures, and among them, the most important living creature, human beings, made in the image of God.
You're unbearably naive.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. First and foremost, I hope each and every single one of you had an absolutely amazing New Year's celebration. I myself have some big plans for 2023, and I cannot wait to bring you all kinds of cool stuff in the near future. Now today, we're going to kick off the new year with part 2 of our look at Pastor Tom Brown of the Pentecostal Word of Life Church in El Paso, Texas. Now, back in part 1, we saw the old hate pastor defeat his own positions on what atheists think about the nature of God and how atheists approach the interpretation of facts about the universe. And now we're going to take a look at the remainder of Tom's videos that are focused on his particularly odd interpretation of what atheism is. In this third video, he makes the very odd claim that atheism has nothing to offer people. And while I think he probably has nothing more than emotional appeals and willful ignorance, let's see what the old hate monger has to say.
Atheism has nothing to offer. That's right. They don't offer a God who loves you, a God who's given you purpose, a God who has sacrificed his life.
Okay, so this is a weird combination of misrepresentation and emotional manipulation, so let's break it down. First, atheism in and of itself doesn't presume to offer anything. That's because atheism is the conclusion that is derived from a critical examination of the theist's claim that a God exists and all the evidence that is available. Second, it would have to be demonstrated that a God actually exists to love anyone before even Christianity can offer that beyond the concept. And third, we understand that human beings each determine their own purpose for their own lives, and those purposes go to informing a great deal of our identities. We also understand that dictating to a person what their purpose is, regardless of how they feel about it, essentially robs them of that aspect of their identity. And lastly, why would an omnipotent God need to sacrifice anything for anyone, and why would we ever assume that we need to be saved from anything? That would just be an emotional appeal predicated on circular reasoning. Any action, task, or goal would be completely arbitrary in the face of an omniscient and omnipotent entity. It wouldn't need to go through any kind of process or rigmarole to accomplish a goal, it would just manifest it, which would mean that any asserted sacrifice by this entity would be completely meaningless. So I guess if atheism were to actually offer anything to anyone, it would likely be protection from the profound psychological harm that Christianity often does to people.
I want you to think for a moment. Contrast the atheistic message with the message of Christianity.
Okay, the atheist message seeks to promote rationality, critical thinking, and intellectual honesty. It validates not only the individual but also the group, it acknowledges that we all share space on this planet, and it promotes freedom and equality. As opposed to the theist message, which seeks to control people by dictating what they should believe, what information they should have access to, what they should think, and how they should feel. It invalidates people by stripping them of their identities, reduces life and everything in it to a brief inconvenience, and promotes willful ignorance and societal division. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Message of Christianity is so positive.
Pretty much just summed up why it isn't.
God created the worlds.
Unfounded claim.
And if he created the worlds, and since he did, then he created it with a purpose.
Non sequitur and emotional appeal. A lack of intention does not entail a logical contradiction.
And what was that purpose? To provide a habitable place called planet Earth.
Argument from incredulity. Just because it contradicts what you believe doesn't make the scientific explanation false.
To raise up living creatures, and among them, the most important living creature, human beings, made in the image of God.
Confirmation bias. Our perceived evolutionary advantages don't make us any more special than any other organism on the planet.
Creatures that have the ability to believe in God.
Non sequitur. Just because you can conceive of a thing doesn't entail that it exists beyond the concept.
But the message of Christianity is that man rebelled against God, very much like a child rebels against their parents.
That's just blatantly incorrect. To rebel against something is to actively choose to act against the asserted authority. In your own worldview, Tom, Adam and Eve had no concept of good and evil before they ate from the tree. Therefore, it's logically entailed that Dust Boy and Rib Girl couldn't possibly have known that disobeying God, or rebelling against him, would be evil or a sin until after the fact. Which means, Tom, in your own worldview, that when the talking snake convinced them to eat of the tree, they didn't choose to rebel, they were simply swayed by a more persuasive argument. And since your God, by definition, possessed infallible foreknowledge of all of these things happening before creation, and then created and had within its control all of these events, it ostensibly set Adam and Eve up to fail.
But God doesn't give up on us.
Then why set up mankind for failure from the start?
He loves us so much that he gave his one and only son.
Another positive claim that you can't back up beyond it being an ancient story.
The message of Christianity is God exists.
Sure, but you can't demonstrate that claim to be true, and as a sort of general rule, everything asserted as true by atheists can be.
And God, the Creator, loves you.
Kind of a waste of its energy, wouldn't you say, Tom?
That's the message of Christianity, and that God can forgive you of your past sins.
Atheists don't believe that God exists, so it would be entailed that they don't believe that sin exists. Come to think of it, I guess that's another thing that atheism kind of offers. Atheism doesn't shackle people from childhood with the psychologically harmful notion that they're born fundamentally broken, and that only with absolute subservience to an external deity that can't even be demonstrated to exist can they be saved from an eternal afterlife of suffering and damnation. So in a roundabout way, Tom, atheists are actually more loving than your God.
So you don't have to live in guilt over your past mistakes that you've made.
That's why we forgive one another, Tom. This isn't exactly a foreign concept. We all make mistakes, and sometimes we harm others with those mistakes. And sometimes we seek forgiveness from those that we have harmed. It can be argued that sometimes we need forgiveness from others and to forgive others in order to facilitate psychological and emotional healing. But if we can forgive one another, then why do we need a third party to forgive us for anything? Especially when that third party is defined as having created us knowing full well in advance all of our actions and all of the outcomes of those actions, essentially judging us eternally for the way it alone decided to make us.
On top of that, God gives you purpose and the promise of eternal life.
A purpose dictated to someone is meaningless. We can determine our own purpose for ourselves, and through that journey we give our lives meaning and direction. So I guess restoring people's identities would be another thing that atheism could offer.
That when you die, you're still going to live on forever, and you're going to live in a place called paradise, heaven.
Tom, I don't think you realize that an eternal afterlife implies that this existence is meaningless. Also, and to be completely honest, an eternal, unchanging existence dedicated to a singular purpose that I never chose would seem like a hell to me. And of course, existing eternally, but not with those whom I love, because your God arbitrarily selected them to go to hell, would also mean that wherever I was could never be a heaven. That is, unless certain aspects of my identity were stripped away from me after I died, so that these problems would never occur to me. But that would imply that whatever goes to heaven or hell wouldn't technically be me. So atheists really have nothing to worry about. Thanks for that, Tom.
Where there would be no more pain or suffering like this present world has.
And the existence of the world is entirely arbitrary. Your God didn't need to make it this way. Your God chose to set it up this way when it could have just made everybody in heaven understanding everything it wanted us to understand and with free will. But it didn't, which means the onus of what happens is not on the created, but on the creator. We're going to skip this section real quick because it's just Tom giving his personal testimony, which of course is something that we cannot possibly determine the truth of, and it honestly bears no relevance to the topic at hand.
And on top of that, I know one day when it's my time to die, I'm not going to go into non-existence.
Well, you actually wouldn't be aware that you didn't exist, which is kind of implied by, the state of not existing. So when you die and you cease to exist, you won't actually care, because there won't be anything that exists to care.
I'm going into the presence of God.
Great. That's another positive claim that you can't possibly back up, but whatever helps you sleep at night.
Now, contrast Christianity's great positive message with the atheists.
Oh, this should be good. Let's see if he hits any of the points that I brought up.
The atheists remind me as Eeyore, the donkey in Winnie the Pooh.
Tom, are you implying that all atheists are depressed? Or that you need the concept of a god in order to stave off your own depression? A word of advice, it's just like stretching. Breathe into the existential dread.
Hello, I'm an atheist. God doesn't love you because God doesn't exist.
Well, aside from the terrible impression, he's right.
The universe is an accident.
Already dispelled that nonsense.
You're an accident. You have no purpose, and when you're dead, you cease to exist.
Well, calling people accidents can come off kind of insensitive, so we prefer the phrase a result of natural process. And we can determine our purposes for ourselves. We don't need a god to dictate them to us. And yeah, the cessation of life is what gives life meaning.
But a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts.
Atheists tend to value everyone and everything in their lives a hell of a lot more than Christians do in theirs, simply by the virtue that we understand that this is all we get. So we actively try our best to make our actions and our relationships count for something.
That's life. The best you can live is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Honestly, I think that would be a little fruitless and kind of tiresome. But hey, if that Epicurean conflation of biblical verses is what someone chooses as their personal philosophy, more power to them.
So how about it, Christians? Would you like to leave the message of God's love for you to join with us in a message of no purpose, no reason to live, and once you're dead, you cease to exist?
Well, that's just a complete misrepresentation of atheism in its entirety. But don't sweat it. We've been misrepresented by these cultists for millennia. We're pretty used to it by now. On the plus side, we do get quite a kick out of exchanging stories of Christian hypocrisy and lying at the atheist office water cooler. So I guess Tom actually did a pretty good job of explaining what atheism has to offer as opposed to Christianity. Freedom of thought, of expression, of identity, an enrichment of life itself, and a profound sense of responsibility for our actions and our inactions because we recognize that we share this planet with so many others. I guess pretty much everything that their God could have possibly offered in their worldview if it hadn't been so busy serving its own ego. Now, in this last video from Tom, he makes the claim that atheism has no common sense. Let's just let the absurdity of that statement sit right there while we dive in.
Atheism doesn't have common sense.
Okay, Tom, but seeing as how you've literally defeated your own position in the previous 3 videos, I'm very curious to hear how you came to this conclusion.
You see, almost the entire world, more than 90% of the world, believes in some form of deity or God that has made the world.
That may be, but that's just an appeal to popularity. It doesn't entail that these gods exist beyond their concepts. And recognizing that lack of logical entailment would actually be a demonstration of common sense. So what was it you were saying, Tom?
Less than 10% of the world's population is atheistic or agnostic. Do you realize that?
A relatively small percentage of supporters does not entail that what they support is the incorrect position. And I'm pretty sure we don't have to invoke Godwin's law or go back to the civil rights movement to conclude that that would also be common sense.
A very small percentage. Now, do you realize it's hard to get almost the entire world agreeing on anything?
I can agree with that. It's completely irrelevant to the topic, but I can agree with it.
When it comes to politics, social issues, morality, I mean, there's just, 60-40%, you know what I mean? And if it's 60-40, then that's a big percentage. That's like a landslide in an election.
You're right, Tom. All of those things that you just mentioned are subjectively determined.
But when you have 90% or more believing in God or some form of God who made the world, then that ought to tell you something, that being an atheist and an agnostic makes no common sense.
Again, without invoking any particular internet laws, suffice it to say history is rife with examples of large populations of people supporting a particular position who were then demonstrated after the fact to have been grossly misinformed, manipulated by the powers that be, or just flat out wrong. Like I said previously, recognizing that just because it's a small portion of the population that supports a position doesn't entail that it's the wrong position is common sense. Agreeing to an argument based on popularity, however, is decidedly not.
How could you, if you're an atheist, say, well, I'm right and almost the entire world is wrong?
Speaking for myself, I can trace that back to two things: that I was raised to never be afraid to ask questions, and my education on the subject. However, not everyone in the world has access to the same level of educational opportunities that I did, and not everyone in the world can break away from their indoctrination as easily as I did. So it's certainly not that atheists are smarter than anyone else, or even that they may think they are. We generally just happen to understand these concepts better than the vast majority of theists. That, and we're not afraid of what a non-God worldview entails.
That almost sounds like a conspiracy theorist.
So, do you want to tell them, or should I?
You know, you're always going to get a small percentage of doctors or lawyers, small percentage of ministers that's going to hold to some outlandish lie. We call it conspiracy theories.
Well, conspiracy theories aren't lies by definition. They're just hypotheses that attempt to explain a particular event by appealing to the unfounded existence of an influential and sometimes sinister organization. And they're often asserted despite the existence of more probable explanations. Conspiracy theories are usually invoked in an attempt to reconcile an intentional cause behind the occurrence of profoundly traumatic events. And they're completely understandable as defense mechanisms against the effects of trauma. And that's because simple or circumstantial explanations for traumatic events don't usually offer a sufficient outlet for that trauma to be directed at. Why scream at an unfeeling universe for the traumas that we endure throughout our lives when we can appeal to or even blame something else for them? Come to think of it, is it me, or does that sound an awful lot like what religions are?
But that's what atheists and agnostics are doing. They're holding to an idea that hardly anyone accepts to be true.
Doesn't mean it's false.
And yet an atheist, an agnostic, thinks their idea is the right one.
We're just following the evidence. It's not our fault that this is where it leads.
And there is validity.
What was that again?
Validity.
Did you mean validity?
In common sense.
Yes, there is some validity in common sense. And it's also common sense to recognize why fallacious reasoning is fallacious. It is, however, not common sense to predicate an entire worldview on something just because it's popular.
Common sense is simply that. It means it is a knowledge in which most people agree to be true.
Wow, Tom, could you have gotten that more wrong? Common sense refers to sound judgment in practical matters. It does not refer to agreeing with concepts just because they're popular. In point of fact, common sense, by definition, would tell you to do just the opposite of that.
And if you can't accept what most people agree to be true, then we really can't have debates or arguments.
Sure we can, Tom. I can demonstrate the flaws in your logic and arguments all day long. Debates are predicated on the existence of fundamentally oppositional positions. But to be honest, you know yourself from experience that you will never win any debates with these kinds of arguments. So, Tom, instead of poisoning the well, how about you just admit that you can't debate any of these topics and get on with your life?
This is why common sense is an important tool in debate.
Actual common sense, Tom, not your twisted version of it.
Atheists and agnostics are rejecting what is common sense to the rest of the world.
Another bald-faced lie. You know, it must be nice to be so completely ignorant of these concepts that you never have to worry about reconciling your faith with your lies and misrepresentation.
And that alone ought to show you how suspect their belief that God doesn't exist or that he's not likely to exist is such a fallacy.
Yeah, not believing in God is not a fallacy, Tom. It's a conclusion from a critical examination of the evidence. Now, from this point of the video, Tom just continues to talk out of his ass and then justifies his ignorance with an appeal to the Bible. But I think that we can all see that the evidence is pretty clear. Not only does Tom have nothing to refute atheism with, but he also seems to lack a fundamental understanding of what atheism is, as well as a lack of fundamental understanding for all of the fallacies fallacies that he's committing. That, or he's fully aware of them and he's just being intellectually dishonest. Whichever it may be, I personally wanted to thank Tom for this series of videos that he did on atheists. Because with them, he's doing the one thing that only Christians could possibly do. And that, of course, is making a better case for atheism than any atheist ever could. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this series, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, January is Poverty Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 4th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, nab yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, or support the podcast is down in the description. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support. I hope you all have a wonderful new year, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.